Looks like we're getting to critical mass. I want to welcome you everyone to our May Day event. May Day, of course, has a celebration, has a long and varied history dating back a millennium, actually. But it became very synonymous with workers and worker power and workers' rights. That grew out of the 19th century labor movement for workers' rights and the 8-hour workday that we still to this day have owed and owe to unions in their work. My name is Jennie Spanos. I am a co-director for Move to Amend. We are an organization that started shortly after, in response to Citizens United back in 2010. When the Supreme Court codified the insane notion that a corporation was a person and that money equaled free speech. We are a multicultural, interracial coalition working to overturn Citizens United and end all corporate constitutional rights, and to also end money as free speech. And we plan to do that by passing the We the People Amendment, constitutional amendment that makes clear that corporation is not a person and that money is not free speech. We do centralize social, environmental, and economic justice in our movement building. And today we have nearly over 500,000 supporters, over 700 endorsing organizations across the nation, and 700 state and local municipalities have passed resolutions and ballot initiatives in support of the We the People Amendment. Of course, we need to pass the We the People Amendment so that what we're going to be discussing tonight will never happen again. Corporations won't have political power to corrupt our political process and use their corporate constitutional rights to protect them from legal accountability. As many of you know, Norfolk Southern trail derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, February 3rd, it's resulted in ongoing health issues among residents and crisis in the community of East Palestine and other communities in the nearby area following the spill and the controlled burning of extremely hazardous chemicals and railroad cars that had polluted the air, land, and water in that area. Railroad industry, of course, thanks to their corporate constitutional rights, have lobbied over the last several years to weaken numerous safety regulations in rail cars and braking systems. The trail lengths and weight have grown, and they've cut railroad workers. The response to the derailment by the Railroad Corporation, the government, and even the regulatory agencies have been nowhere near what's needed to provide the relief and recovery after this catastrophe. So railroad workers and their unions have been warning us, right? They've been in the news a lot lately, but they had been warning us about the inadequate safety measures that have been threatening the workers and the area's residents around those communities. Now they're working with others to hold Norfolk Southern Corporation fully accountable for the accident, and they're also educating and organizing for changes to prevent future derailments. So it's in that spirit that I honor and introduce our guests tonight. We have Clyde Whitaker with us he's a state legislative director for the Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation, or SMART union out of Ohio, and also Gene Esterly, and he's a chair and legislative representative for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen in Ohio. Welcome, Clyde and John. How are y'all tonight?
Good, Jenny. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for having us.
Oh, it's an honor to have you here. Before we get started, I want to do just some quick logistics. If anybody has any questions they would like to ask John or Clyde, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them before the end of the program. And so I'm looking forward to hearing how we're going to hold these folks accountable and what we need to do to support you in that. Clyde, would you like to open us up?
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you, Greg, and members of Move to Amend America for inviting me to speak. Just a little background on me. My name's Clyde Whitaker. I'm State Legislative Director for Smart Transportation. We represent approximately 3,000 railroad workers in the crafts of engineer, conductor, yard master, trained persons, and retirees. Fourth generation railroader hailing from East Tennessee. I moved to Ohio to pursue a railroad career. I have 23 years experience in the industry and 20 or so years as a union officer in various roles. I've worked in many areas of the railroad as a conductor, from small switching operations to the big hump yards. Then promoted to locomotive engineer for 12 years. In that specific time frame, I operated almost every train out there except for the circus train. So and the railroaders will get the circus train I'm talking about. So let's talk about why the wheels are literally falling off the trains. Seems like almost every week, even today, we're plagued with a derailment on a major scale. Why is that? We are experiencing the fallout of years of railroad operating model called precision schedule railroading, which is essentially a cut your way to profit model, which is obviously no longer sustainable. Right now, the best solution to combat this problem is the Brown-Vance Rail Safety Act of 2023. What I would consider to be the largest step in rail safety in decades. The bill addresses items that will correct the railroad's behavior and how they operate. As of right now, they still make record profits despite almost blowing a town off the map. Don't get me wrong, making money is fine, but do it responsibly for the workers and the citizens. Just to give everybody a little brief on what's in this bill. Crew size, the current standard in the United States is the rule of two, what we call it in the crafts. So why are two people so important in a locomotive cab? This protects in-cab safety, which is currently the status quo. Crew members rely on one another to remain vigilant while operating these massive trains. Due to an unpredictable work schedule, fatigue is our number one enemy and is very dangerous. Locomotive engineers are stressed to the max with technology in the cab, this ranging from standard gauges, positive train control, fuel-saving technology, as well as standard risk of the job. The focus is more on the controls and the computers than looking forward in a traditional manner in years past. The conductor must keep the engineer on his toes, and they must work together to assure each are doing their job. The rule 2 is also so important due to rural areas in which we operate. We need someone there in the event of a medical emergency or a crash. Just an example, we had a recent derailment in West Virginia on CSX due to a landslide. It took 2 people to get help for an immediate response. If we just have one person in the cab of that locomotive, it could probably take an hour or hours for a response. We also operate as a sounding board to one another to make sound decisions, comply with rules, discuss dangers of the job task, and advise of speed restrictions and many other job-related tasks. So technology has come up, like, the railroads taunt their, technology is the savior. Well, take an incident like East Palestine. When that train stopped, so did the technology. That was it. Technology could not do what the role of that crew did. And that's one thing that really ticks me off about Alan Shaw, tucking out both sides of his mouth. He praises the crew 1 minute, and he's actively trying to eliminate part of the crew. And that's just not right. So anyway, off my soapbox there. The conductor, he or she is the one that evaluates the situation in order to give emergency responders adequate information on situations such as East Palestine. The railroad CEOs, I've heard Alan Shaw argue that he believes in the science. They're going to follow the data, and he believes there's no data on crew size. And for years, being at the State House and DC lobbying, I have to contest that. With one cab crew person in the cab of a locomotive, In 2008, Chatsworth, California, we had 25 people killed. 2017, we had 3 killed, 62 injured. Philadelphia, 8 killed in 2015. And the biggest, Locomotive in Quebec, Canada, 47 people dead, and an entire town turned ash and over 800 evacuated. What more data do we need to prove it's unsafe to have one person in a cab of a locomotive? Rail car inspections, that would change under the Brown-Vance bill. They would have a minimum set time requirement adequate enough for a qualified person to inspect a rail car. Each side of a rail car has 90 points of inspection. And right now, they're expected to complete those in 60 seconds or less, or they're subject to discipline. Defect detectors, Brother Esterly and I, and several other people, we were very successful in passing 2-person crew legislation in the state of Ohio, and also wayside defect detector language. We're the first state in the country to be able to pull off this kind of language. But we need to go a step further at this point. We set the bar, we need to raise the bar. We need legislation to set thresholds and technology standards on these detectors. This bill would accomplish that. Right now, the railroads, the issue was with East Palestine, you have what's called trending defect detector technology. And what that is essentially, as the train progresses over defect detectors, it monitors the heat going up on this wheel bearing or wheel set. And a person in Atlanta, Georgia sees this temperature rising. Well, there's no regulations and the railroads can do what they want. So if that person in Atlanta, Georgia sees that temperature is getting hotter, but this crew's almost to their crew change point in Pennsylvania, let's just take a chance, right? It's like rolling a dice. We're going to take the chance, get this train to where it's going. Hopefully it doesn't derail. And if it does derail, our quarterly profits will go down, but we'll be okay. So that bill addresses that. The one portion I do like, Senator Brown and Vance both talked about accountability. Audits on the railroads regarding rail car inspections. During the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee, it was presented that some rail cars had operated over 90,000 miles without an inspection. That's crazy. Civil penalties against the railroads right now, it's a drop in the bucket for them. Usually they're anywhere from $3,000 and up. I haven't seen one, maybe John has. The highest one I've seen is about 17, 18,000. But that would change. I think the bill needs to be taken a step further because the safety complaints that I've seen throughout this state boil down to local managers or division managers making very careless acts, again, rolling the dice. I think those people need a personal fine for putting the public and our railroad crews in danger. But that's just some of the takeaways that are important to our organization. The House, like I said, has passed 2-person crew legislation before. We are the 9th state, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, John, I believe we're the 9th state to pass 2-person crew. It's just common sense. And my take, I hear some of these legislators in DC preach safety. They believe in protecting the communities. Well, let's do it right. Support the bill. But I would encourage everyone on this call tonight to reach out to your House representatives, because that's where the big hurdle is going to be in your state, to get your House representatives to support this bill. Let's get it across the finish line. It looks like it's going to pass the state, no issue. Or the Senate, I'm sorry. So again, Jennie, Greg, thank you for having me here, and Brother Esterly.
Well, thank you so much. Again, thank you to Jennie and Greg for inviting us to speak. Clyde and I have kind of been doing the rail safety tour around Ohio and beyond over the past 3 months. So we're getting to be old hat at these types of conversations, unfortunately. So again, my name is John Esterly. I am the chairman of the Ohio State Legislative Board for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. Clyde and I might have different titles, but we basically do the same thing for the same groups of people, both here in Ohio. I am also a fourth generation railroader. Clyde's got me by a few years on the railroad. I've been on the railroad now just over 12 years. I've spent most of that time in some capacity as a union officer, and I've been in this role for about 2 years now. So I thought I would start by maybe telling a story that we've heard before, but maybe with some details that really haven't been highlighted that I think need to be. So on February 3rd of this year, the 32N entered the state of Ohio. It was recrewed in Toledo at a normal interchange point. It passed through the city of Toledo, through the city of Sandusky, through the city of Cleveland, finally through Ravenna, and then it derailed it shortly before 9 p.m. Just outside the city of East Palestine. We can talk quite a bit about the details leading up to that event. I think Brother Whitaker has highlighted a lot of the contributing factors with the defect detectors and the lack of communication between the dispatching center and the crew on the train. Also the amount of time that the car inspectors are given to inspect these cars. I gave similar testimony yesterday in front of the Ohio Senate Select Committee on Rail Safety, and just the sheer number of folks that we've got in the industry has been reduced so dramatically over the past 5 years that we've got less people trying to do more work. So they just don't have the same amount of time to do the inspections that they used to. And that's something that needs to change, because a lot of these issues can be solved right there in the track. They're very minor repairs that don't need a whole lot of attention. They just need to be given the time to do those. So that's kind of looking back on what caused East Palestine. But what I'd really like to highlight is what happened immediately after the derailment. So as the defect detector at East Palestine broadcast its message and let the crew know that there was an issue, the conductor immediately got into his paperwork. He was told the car number and the axle number. That's part of the automated message. He determined that car was carrying hazardous material, and immediately started going through the rest of his paperwork, finding the shipping papers, which have crucial contact information for the shippers. He found the railroad equivalent of the MSDS sheets for those that are familiar with hazardous materials. So he knew what to do and what the required procedure was, the recommended procedure from the Federal Railroad Administration, and was prepared to respond. Shortly after the derailment, he began his inspection, dismounted the locomotive, turned to face the site of the derailment, and as you can imagine, saw a pretty horrific sight. The crew was very quick to act. They made decisions in the spur of the moment to separate the locomotives from the rest of the train and proceed about a mile east of the site of the initial derailment. And this saved lives. I mean, there's no question in my mind that action saved lives. They removed somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 gallons of diesel fuel from an active fire. Who knows how bad the situation could have been if that would have still been there and part of the scene. They preserved critical event recorder data. All of the locomotives have black boxes very similar to what you'd imagine on a commercial airliner. So the railroad and the National Transportation Safety Board have been able to look at that data and determine, what happened on the engine. And, these are things we can learn about that. So those are the good things. I think there's definitely an opportunity there with inspections, with training. These are things that Clyde and I talk about every day. where we've got definite holes or issues in the system. One thing I guess it's kind of maybe a scary thought to talk about, but it's something that I keep in the back of my mind. So very shortly after the disaster in East Palestine, I read an article about defect detectors and what it would cost to improve and install defect detectors across the nation to what most experts would consider to be the point of safety. And the figure that they threw out was about $1.6 billion. So that's not just Norfolk Southern, that's not just East Coast, that's every railroad across the country, $1.6 billion. So, Norfolk Southern yesterday released their first quarter profits, and they estimate so far East Palestine has cost them about $376 million. So they're getting very close to having the site of the incident cleaned up. I would estimate that we'll be looking somewhere around a $500 million mark for the complete cleanup of the site. So that means we can have 3 East Palestines before we have reached the cost of implementing defect detectors. And the reason I say that is because the railroads employ actuarial scientists. And much like the automotive industry in the 70s and 80s, they make decisions based solely on what something is going to cost. So we have an East Palestine level catastrophe about every 10 to 15 years in the railroad industry. So if you do all the math on that, they could go 30 years before they justify the expense of defect detectors. And the reason I say that is there is no financial motivation for the railroads to do this, to be safer. That's why it's so critical that we motivate them through legislation, through regulation, and through public shame, if nothing else, where we force them to be better citizens of the communities that they operate through. A couple of good things. I know Brother Whitaker talked at length about the Senate version of the rail safety bill that Senators Brown and Vance have introduced in the U.S. Senate. There is a companion bill, the Rail Act, which is in the House. I will be very blunt. The Senate version is good, not great, and the House version is not even good. So we need to push very hard for those two bills to be conferenced together with more of the Senate language in there. And I think as Brother Whitaker highlighted, most of the crucial aspects of that have to do with crew size. And then there's also a lot of language having to do with hazardous materials and how they're transported and how those things are reported to various agencies. The only other thing that I would like to point out, I'm going to drop a link in the chat here for everybody, so give me just a moment. Just today, the Federal Railroad Administration released a new safety advisory. It wasn't supposed to be publicly announced, although it's for public consumption at this point until next week. But all of the rail publications have already released this information, so that this is definitely for public consumption. But this talks quite a bit about rail accidents and how things like train makeup, train length, positioning of distributed power throughout the train have contributed to some major accidents throughout the country. Particularly of note, 2 out of the 3 they cite are in Ohio. Ravenna last year, and then in March, the derailment that we had just outside of Springfield. So I would encourage folks to look into that. They give 8 recommendations at the very end of the document. And, unfortunately, these are just those. They're safety advisories, they're recommendations, there's no teeth to them. So I would encourage everybody on this call to get with their representatives at the federal level and say, hey, we like this, but we need it to have teeth. We need some kind of regulatory authority behind it. So, as NTSB presents their final findings on East Palestine, which I expect later this year or early next, there's going to be a big conversation about what the regulatory framework looks like and what changes we need to make. And I think, there are some very, very good suggestions in the document that I just shared. So with that, I thank you again for the opportunity to be here. More than happy. I see there's some questions building up in the chat. So I think, Clyde and I would be happy to entertain those as we go forward. Greg or Jenny, one of you wants to kind of prompt those to us, and we're happy to contribute.
Excellent. I do want to ask, have either one of you been to East Palestine since the derailment?
Yes.
How's the community faring? Can you share with us, how are they doing? I mean, folks were asleep in their beds, right?
Yeah.
Well, they're doing as well as you would expect, given the gravity of the scenario that they've been through. I think normal is a long way away for a lot of these people. I mean, just physically speaking. So I don't know if Clyde mentioned this, but Norfolk Southern has completed the abatement on the South Rail, and they have begun abatement on the North Rail. So in terms of total cleanup, they're just over halfway. A lot of the folks have returned home. But I think ultimately the long-term effects will be years before we know what this is actually going to do to the community. So I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of concern.
You know, that area, I went up the Wednesday after the derailment, and I talked to several of the residents. It reminds me of a area where I grew up, and just people are scared how they can get on with their lives. One lady, she started crying on me. She's like, I was about ready to sell my house and move. She had all the pictures of her children and grandkids all packed up, and like the person that was going to buy her house bailed out. You know, so that's a big issue there. Who knows if Norfolk Southern will make that right? You know, what is the right thing to do? Which is something I question, because 9 days after this catastrophe, we almost had a repeat east of Cleveland. And I'd mentioned that in the DC hearing, and I've still yet to get a call from Mr. Shaw. That way he can correct his railroad's behavior. So I entertain his call whenever he feels like it, wants to do the right thing. So.
Yeah, I wouldn't, certainly don't want to sit on your laurels until that happens.
Yeah.
I know that the union members, the railroad union members, are already maxed out. You know, prior to this, we had all heard threats of going on strike because, you know, of the absolute insane working conditions, as far as not being able to take any time off, you know, no family life, none of that. How would you, how are the union members doing? How is this affecting their everyday workplace, their state of mind? You know, can you give us a little picture about how that's personally affecting your union members?
I would say it's, I mean, I've ran these long trains, John has as well. It's very stressful because you make one wrong move, you can pile that train up. We're not built in this country to run these trains at astronomical lengths that we're doing. Train makeup plays a lot in this, and that needs attention. We should not be putting empty cars sandwiched in the middle of loads like the Springfield derailment that just pop out of the train. Railroading's been around for over 100 years. We know better than this. And yet when our members bring this to the attention of management, it's, shut your mouth, get out the door, move your train down the track. Again, it's all about chance. And John, I don't know if you got anything to add.
I think there's, much like there are with the residents of East Palestine, and I would argue, residents that live near rail traffic across the country. This has certainly shined a light on the industry. I think our members I think there's a genuine fear that I haven't seen before, that either they will be, on the news tomorrow because they're the next one, or, even worse, that something will happen and they won't make it home. We very unfortunately lost a member on March the 7th up in Cleveland. And there's a stark reality that we live in work in a very unforgiving industry. And I think just a lot of the exposure that we've seen between East Palestine, between the Springfield incident shortly thereafter, and then immediately followed by, the death in Cleveland, it weighs on you very much in a psychological fashion. So in addition to just the general struggles that we deal with every day, having chosen this career, we've got these additional pressures on us. And I think it's definitely been a challenge, at least here in Ohio, what I've seen.
In the railroads, they purposely did this over the years with crew reductions, staffing reductions, because they just don't care. And like John said, they just compound more work on everybody. You come home, you drive an hour home. Yeah, you hang out with your kids or your wife for an hour. You go to sleep for a few hours. Phone rings again. You're right back out there. Like Norfolk Southern, they need to hire people. But the biggest thing is they're doing the hiring. It's the retaining. And that in itself is creating an ultimate fatigue issue with our craft employees in transportation and engine service. And that's a scary thing there. I think their retention rate's less than 24% of what they hire. So.
Yeah, cutting staff by a third, and bonuses have been flowing freely, right? Southern.
Not to us, but
not to y'all.
I hear a rumor that someone's getting that money. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, insane. Record enough for profits. I do have a couple more questions I'm eager to ask, but I think we should look and see chat. Greg, would you like to do the honors of?
Yeah, we can take one or two and then go other lines. Hey, Bill asks, sort of following what both of you have just mentioned, particularly John, about the fact that the trains are longer and heavier. Train was not classified as hazardous. Also, a comment on the braking issue.
So I'll field the first part of that because that was very integral to the testimony I gave yesterday. So one thing that I guess a lot of us in the industry have found out, shame on us for not knowing this better beforehand, but there is very little regulation that's actually on the books that has to do with hazardous materials. So the regulatory bodies really only identify 3 different specific hazards that need to be monitored with any more scrutiny than any other shipment, and that is poisonous inhalation cars, things like anhydrous ammonia, chlorine gas, stuff that you do not want to be around and inhale. Spent nuclear fuel, and then also what they classify as a high hazard flammable train, or HHFT. And these that last classification comes directly from the Lac-Mégantic disaster in Canada 10 years ago. Outside of that, and I will echo Governor DeWine's genuine concern that the 32N that was involved in this disaster was not classified as anything more than just a standard train. And unfortunately, there was nothing that Norfolk Southern did wrong there. It just did not check one of those 3 boxes. So one of the recommendations that I gave in my testimony yesterday, and I would encourage folks on this call to echo to their federal representatives, is the industry has a very thorough book of policies and procedures related to hazardous materials. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and I feel that it's a good document. The problem is it's issued by the industry, and they have no regulatory requirement to comply with it. So although there's good stuff in there, if today they need to ignore one of the rules that they've created for themselves to get a train out on time, or to save a recrew, or whatever that case may be, they're just going to do it, and there's no culpability with the regulatory bodies. So I would encourage folks to do that. And then Clyde, I'll defer the braking question to you, because I don't want to be doing all the talking tonight.
So the braking, the questions come up, why didn't the crew apply the brakes? You know, when you have a hot box detector sound an alarm saying that you have something wrong with the wheel set, journal, whatever the case may be, applying the brakes is the last thing you want to do. Meaning the air brakes on the rail car. What the standard operating procedures normally are, you go into dynamic braking immediately as soon as you hear that alarm. And bear in mind, this train went across 2 prior detectors. The detectors picked the heat signature up, but did not notify the crew. That's where the issue lies. Immediately, as soon as that second detector is seen, this car's getting hotter, the railroad should have told the crew to stop. But when a train crew receives a alarm, they go into dynamic braking, which is a reduction of the traction. The traction motors reverse, which are attached to the wheels on the locomotives. It exhausts that energy out to bring the train to a stop. And once you're almost at a walking speed, the locomotive engineer applies the brakes on the locomotives, leaves the cars untouched. The conductor immediately begins walking the train to identify the defect, and at which point, either a few things can happen. The car will be repaired. Sometimes it's a handbrake on a car. We knock that off, let the car cool off for a little bit, go on down the railroad. No harm, no foul. Happens every day. The other thing is, if it's too bad, we do a walk with the car at a walking speed to a place where we can set this car out safely for repair of mechanical forces that travel. It's also been brought up about the Trump era where he rolled back some Barack Obama's regulations on electronic brakes. Electronic brakes would not have helped in this instance. But I will say, whenever a train goes in emergency, these longer trains that we have right now, the average in Ohio is over 10,000 feet at the moment. That's just data we've been collecting in this office for the past 2 years. So the longer train, when it derails, the more disaster you're going to have. Smaller train, less disaster. So, and a lot, you have a lot more physics involved with the longer train, undulating grades. I always use the phrase, the train's like a slinky. You tie this around your ankle, we hook a bowling ball to your front of your slinky, you come to a stop, bowling ball just barely touches you. Now you get a longer train, we tie this bowling ball on the rear end like this train where 40% of the weight was. This comes to a complete stop. What's the bowling ball do? Comes in hard. Then we have a catastrophic disaster like we've been seeing. And that goes back to train makeup, but that's just a little simplified 101 how train physics works.
For a long time, being in Florida, you know, we used to have a choo-choo train on our Constitution. Because to get anything passed here, you know, you could do a ballot. One of the ways you could do it is a ballot initiative and then get it on the in the Constitution. And the people in Florida had voted to upgrade. This was, you know, 15, 20 years ago, to upgrade our system. Maglev train, you know, they're on every continent except the US. So we do, as you alluded to, you know, the regulatory agencies, you know, they find their foundation in what the railroad has done, right? They created the first regulatory agency in the country. And since then, you know, other industries have used that model to create their own regulatory agencies, or, you know, the perception that they're being regulated, but like John said, they're actually wrote the regulations and they choose what they use. So do you think that the regulatory agencies are more responsive to industry or protecting the public?
Can I answer that, John?
Sure.
So one thing I want to interject on that comment. with the regulatory agencies, they depend on the railroad's money and facilities like in Pueblo, Colorado. The railroads fund that. So all the testing, all the data, it's in control of the railroads. It's not in control of the government or these regulatory bodies. The regulatory bodies depend on the railroads to fund it, and they just look at the numbers and just go on with it. So, but that's my thought on that.
I would also add that let's assume a perfect world where the regulatory body is going to enforce everything that they've got the ability to enforce. The issue that we've run into as we've seen precision scheduled railroading spread is the carriers are coming up with new operations that no one ever considered when these regulations were written. So there is nothing in the regulation that specifically prohibits it. And a lot of these bodies, the way that they've been trained over the years is if it's not in the regulation, there's nothing we can enforce. So the railroad is free to do what they want. So I guess if I had my one dream is that the rank and file regulatory agents would have the authority or be empowered to say, hey, this is not safe, so we're going to stop it until we have an opportunity to really investigate what's going on. And even if it's not in black and white in the Code of Federal Regulation, we know it's not good, so we're not going to do it until we figure out the best way to handle it. It's a very tough situation when the fox is guarding the hen house, as it were.
Yeah,
Indeed.
So
Greg?
couple of questions here to combine. One, one is, will there really ever be a complete cleanup from your perspective? And what about this change Warner suggests? Nationalize the railroads. Where do you guys stand on that? So two different questions.
I'll field the first one, and then I'll let you answer the second one first before we come back. So will East Palestine ever be cleaned up? So, I don't think human involvement will ever clean it up, right? I don't think we'll ever do enough to get it right. However, and I don't want to speak for folks that are in the environmental field, but as I've done a lot of investigation and met with folks since February, Mother Nature does a pretty good job of cleaning up our messes if we let her. So I think time and just allowing the passage of time and allowing these chemicals to be diluted and diluted and diluted until the point that they're no longer above any threshold that we could measure is what's going to eventually solve it. Now, the problem is while we're waiting, people have lives to live and businesses have to run. And so I think, I don't know that there's any amount of effort that Norfolk Southern or any other body could put into East Palestine to make it right that we won't have to at some point just wait for it to clean itself up.
So I was recently in Youngstown with Sheriff Brown. He had a doctor, I believe she's got a title that long. She deals with chemicals and teaches about chemicals. I had to ask about the dilution of this chemical. So it has an off chemical to it. And those are called permanent or forever chemicals. So basically, this chemical's leached all the way down the Ohio River into the Gulf and out into the ocean. So not only Ohioans will feel this effect, but several other people. As far as nationalizing the railroads, that's a slippery slope, I feel. I have mixed thoughts on that. I think it would be next to impossible to pull off. Do I see them possibly becoming regulated once again? That's quite possible. That's all contingent upon the Surface Transportation Board and how they service their customers. I would encourage everybody to go back through the archives of this past year on the STB files and last year and listen to some of the testimony of what these customers went through. The customers are not happy with the railroads either. They're held hostage in most cases because they're landlocked in by the railroad. Um, yeah, I really don't have an answer to it.
I guess if I can maybe build on that too. So I think it's pretty well established that our country is very fortunate to have the premier freight rail network in the world. And as much as it may, I may be the jerk in the room to say that, but a portion of that is because the rail carriers have some financial motivation to maintain that network and to allow it to work the way that it does. Clyde and I and our members don't like longer trains carrying more stuff, but that's part of the reason that we're able to move as much as we are in light of the staffing reductions. So nationalizing the railroad, again, I would agree. I think it's a slippery slope. And it's what I would be very concerned about is we have trouble financing the most important projects that we have across this country, and to roll that all in and send it to Washington and ask them to write a check every year. Again, if we thought COVID was bad with supply chain shortages, if we have to shut the railroad down for 4 days because the House can't decide on what they're going to fund, and now we've got federally owned railroads, I think that could pose some pretty major issues. Now, I will also say that the other side of that coin is there is definitely an opportunity for us to improve the amount of regulation that we see there. I think the Staggers Act has run its course. I think we've kind of shown that a lot of the stuff that was in there 40 years ago when they passed it we've wrung the towel out and there's no water left. So
Yeah, and to that
Yeah.
point, like if the railroads, let's just say they became nationalized and here we are in a budget crunch, we're threatening to shut off government programs. It's going to be the same thing at the railroad. We think inflation's bad now. The railroads haul everything that's raw material. We're the first or the last, and the trucks pick up, from there and deliver it to the store. But if the trains ain't moving coast to coast, everything is going to go sky high. Food, milk, gasoline, you name it. Everything's affected by the railroads.
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt the
Andy?
importance of the railroads on the country and for the country. I could see some benefits too. Thank you for sharing your opinions and your thoughts on that. Let me ask you this. Does Norfolk Southern or the railroad industry, do you think that they have a history of keeping the information and their practices shielded from the public? I think as a
Absolutely.
nationalized organization, we probably wouldn't have that. That is a direct result, right, of them exercising their Fourth Amendment right to privacy. And in that, obscuring some of their malicious practices. And like you said, although the workers, it's not trickling down, but there's record number profits. Somebody's putting that somewhere. And that would be nice to put that where it needs to be, like hiring and retaining and protecting our communities and our workers. Greg, do you have some more questions?
Yeah, two that are kind of related to the accountability of the company itself. One having to do with the amount of money. Funny how Norfolk, well, the other one here is I'll read this one. Funny how no one at Norfolk is facing criminal charges. So there's financial liability, but not really legal liability to speak of. It seems to me that as long as corporations can spend or donate as much as they need to stop regulations for its industries, we can expect more accidents. In terms of criminal charges, sometimes, at least in the past, criminal charges that resulted in companies actually having their corporate charter revoked and basically put out of business, and their business taking their company. That is sort of the ultimate accountability. And the other question has to do with, I was asked about the amount of money that has been spent for lobbying and campaign contributions. And Clyde, you responded to that. Do you have how much money the railroads put into lobbying as well as campaign contributions for legislation to help keep their profits high and I guess regulations low as well? And you put in 654. So I'm assuming you're saying that's $64 million as of September 13, 2022. So elaborate on one or both of those.
So going back to the criminal charge, just for example, if I'm on a cell phone and I'm operating a train going down the track, I'm subject to a fine, a personal fine. I'm decertified and I don't come back to work until that fine's paid. Now, we take some of these managers that are on a division level, meaning they control a portion of the railroad, not the whole railroad, just a portion. These managers that we've seen on Norfolk Southern's Keystone division make and take a lot of chances. They endanger our crews, they endanger the public. And like I said earlier, I'd really like to see these people receive a personal fine and they don't come back to work until they pay it. And the railroad should not be allowed to pay that for them because those people are conscious of the decision they're making. But that's just my opinion. The railroads get by with just about anything they want for the past, several decades. Both all the rail labor unions, we work our tail ends off to combat this stuff. It's never ending, but they've got a lot of money. I believe they employ over, if I recall, 90 lobbyists in DC, compared to like John's union, my union, we've got 2 apiece there. So that's 4 guys versus 90. And we're trying to preach the truth, and the railroads put their own little spin on it, but lobbying money and PAC funds, that all contributes as well to changing somebody's mind. You give this person a lot of money, they're going to look the other way. That's just the way it is. The railroads spend close to what Big Pharma does in lobbying. So we know how that goes, don't we? So, John?
We certainly do.
I think another thing that really doesn't get mentioned is the railroad industry has done a very, very good job over probably the last 40 years of convincing America that we don't exist anymore, that you don't need to worry about us. We're that old antiquated mode of transportation. You don't see us, you don't think about us. And because of that, we're not necessarily the first thing that you think of when you think of lobbying efforts. And as Clyde said, when they put the amount of just bandwidth and dollars behind their message to Congress, and the general public isn't really thinking about the railroad industry, those two things add together to be very, very, very impactful and very, very, very persuasive. I think it's starkly different than the pharma industry, where everybody talks about it, everybody thinks about it. And I know for the past 3 months, we've had lots of conversations about the rail industry, but I think we can all be frank here that we would not be having this discussion. Clyde and I would not be sitting here today if not for East Palestine. So without that nexus to get us here, these conversations wouldn't happen and things would be going on as they always have in DC and in Columbus and across the country. So I think there's definitely some things that need to be said about that. Greg, you and I had the conversation on Monday. There's just so much money in politics right now. And the amount of influence that has for, career politicians, which most of the folks in DC, that's what we see. So
And, after East Palestine, I really think if John and I hadn't start rattling cages and, just kind of extremely ruffling people's feathers, uh, and putting our jobs at risk too, because we can be retaliated against as well by other railroads. I think East Palestine would have just faded away. It's one of the biggest disasters that I've seen on a railroad since I've been here, and it's sad what's happened. You know, I mean, they keep pumping money into it, but money doesn't always fix emotional damages. So,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we do owe it to the people and to the workers to get to the bottom of why this happened and how we can make sure that this never happens again. I did want to highlight that this recording will be sent out to everyone that registered. So I just wanted to bring that to your attentions. And I also agree that if we just classify this as a tragedy and just stop there, it's to make these accidents and these risks that are going to happen because you're cutting corners, you're adding more cars, you're adding more longer hours, all to extract the profits and being able to get away with that because of, again, corporate constitutional rights. The first time that we saw any mention of a corporation being a person started with Southern Pacific Railroad and versus or Santa Clara County. So, it's been a long time, and it isn't by accident. This is fixed. It is rigged. We that's what we're working towards, is trying to change that. Do we have any more questions, Greg, that we want to ask? I know we're
Yeah,
at the hour, so
almost that time, but here's one from Deb. I gotta wonder, sort of a comment, reflection, and a question. I gotta wonder if the railroads will ever change their ways as long as they can claim so-called constitutional rights, of which we've heard, like First Amendment free speech rights of corporations, which allows them to contribute money, and then Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights, that privacy that shields them from having to disclose. What do you think? Are corporations so powerful that things won't or can't change?
I could answer that very quickly, and that's no, they won't. That's the reality is having to, comply with things like regulatory reform costs money, and more money means less profit, and less profit means, the shareholders maybe sell your stock and buy something else. So I think that's why it's so crucial for us to take stock of what we've learned from East Palestine and really circle together and pick the things that are most important to make our railroads safer and move forward with those things. And hopefully that's what we will see with the federal legislation. I'd like to see some regulatory reform pair with that. I know Clyde and I have this conversation regularly. I am a fan of legislation in lieu of regulation because it takes a lot more to make legislation go away. Regulatory reform can be backed off just as easily by the next administrator of whatever department you're in, as we saw under the Vittori administration. So I don't, corporations are not going to change unless we come up with a way to make them. They're big behemoths. They know how to do one thing, and that's how, to grind the earth and spit out money. And we've got to do something to change that behavior.
That's what our amendment is all about.
I
Make
would
sure
just,
they're not legal persons.
I would just echo what John said there. Like he said, we've had this discussion a million times over in all the years, even all the years we worked together on the railroad. But the coin term that railroaded didn't come overnight, right? It's been out there forever. There's a reason for that, and everybody's finally seeing it.
yeah, thank you for that. Railroaded. I hadn't drawn that connection or connected those dots, and you're absolutely right. Thank you for what you are doing. It is really important, and I know that union work can be, like you said, dangerous, and also being retaliated against by one of the biggest industries in the country. you know, that's something that you wake up with and you still come to work every day. So we really, really appreciate you and what you're doing. I will say that the railroad workers and the union was on my radar way before East Palestine because of the work that you are doing and under the conditions that you're doing it. And laws are very important and necessary. They can, but unfortunately they can be temporary, right? Because of these corporate constitutional rights, they still keep trumping over and over again. And they are very good at doing what they're doing. So in addition to electing better people and passing better laws and creating better regulations, we do think that it's essential to address the root cause of governing power of Norfolk Central and the rest of the railroad corporations because of, again, the corporate constitutional rights, which, you know, wasn't on anybody, well, except maybe Greg's radar 10 years ago. And you know, it's coming out and talking about these things and learning more about it and the education, and like y'all are doing, educating about what's going on with the railroad and how we can make things safer for not just the workers, but all things. I do want to make a couple of announcements before we, you know, let y'all have some closing statements, but of course, one way to show your support is signing the petition, movetoamend.org/motion. That's how we show power and how many people we have in support of this. Also, if you're part of an organization, you can endorse Move to Amend, the We the People Amendment. And you can find that at movetoamend.org/endorsements. Super simple. And if you want to help lobby your rep to co-sponsor, go to movetoamend.org lobby and sign up. And also, if John and Clyde, if you can, if you have it in your link, otherwise we'll put it in the follow-up of how they can connect to the two bills that you are talking about so that they can share that while they're doing their lobbying efforts. That would be great. And if you're a union member and connected in any way in worker union organizing, and you would like to support in that way, get involved in the labor caucus. And you can just contact Greg for that. And that's greg@movetoamend.org. So if there's not, do you have any more questions, Greg, before we let John and Clyde?
I don't think, let's just see, number of comments. I don't believe so. I'm sorry if I missed any. Just a link to interview, I guess, that Clyde was part of a few months ago.
That would be great. Maybe we could put that in the follow-up as well, so folks can find it. I did want to throw out a couple of things. I do want to throw out a couple of for your informations. Like they had mentioned before, the railroad has spent over $165 billion in their own stock buybacks. Over a third of all rail jobs have been cut. This is all since 2015. So, you know, these steps, like you said, aren't by accident. They made these knowing the risks, and they've put profit over safety time and time again. So I want to open it up, John and Clyde, if you had anything else you wanted to say before we move on.
Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. This is my life's work, is making sure that the railroads are safe for my members, and beyond that, for the general public, the folks that we interact with every day as we pass through their communities. So when something like East Palestine happens, I mean, I guess to put everyone at ease, this is definitely the edge case. The last major issue like this that I could recall, and Clyde, correct me if I'm wrong, was Graniteville back in 2005. So these don't happen often, but that doesn't make them any less important to talk about. It's you know, our retirement, Clyde and I's, depend on the railroad continuing to succeed as a business. So I'm mindful of the fact that, you know, we need to be we can't have these companies go out of business, but I think there's something to be said for being good stewards of the environment and good stewards of the communities that we pass through. And you know, the profit margin cannot be the only metric that we look at. So, you know, at least until March 6th of 2041, which is the day that I pull the pin for the last time, I'd like the railroad to be around so that I've got, you know, a place to call home. But the other side of that is I want to be able to be there, and I want you to be able to be there. So we need to make sure that incidents like East Palestine don't become the norm. My biggest concern, and I'm sure Clyde would agree, is we are trending in the wrong direction. The amount of derailments that we are seeing is going up. The severity of derailments that we are seeing is going up. And this is due in no small part to train makeup, train length, train weight. These are all major contributing factors. And I think that's why FRA was so specific in their recommendations in the document that I shared earlier, because these are the forces and the factors that are contributing to the increase and the severity of these derailments. So I think there's definitely a balance that can be struck between safe rail operations where Clyde and I and our members can get our little piece, and the shareholders can get their little piece, and everybody goes home happy. But to do that, we need you know, sensible regulation, sensible legislation, and the ability to move forward with that. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be here. And if anybody has any specific questions for me, I very early on shared my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk.
Put it in again.
Okay.
Thank you so much, John. Clyde?
I would just echo, I mean, John and I, we kind of came into our roles about the same time. I've been in this role for 3 years now. Just looking back at past files, we've seen more derailments in my 3-year tenure as a director than the past 2 terms of the previous director. And we've had 2 fatalities in our state in the past 3 years. And the railroads, they want to preach safety's number one, safety's number one. Well, it is number one to them until they have to spend a penny on it. And that's where John and I come in. And that's where we need everybody pulling on the rope to do their part to help us push favorable legislation to keep not only our members safe, but the public safe, because everything we do affects everyone in the public realm. And I do agree, and I've said it for a long time, there needs to be a balance. When's enough money? They got to be responsible. They're reckless right now, especially Norfolk Southern. The other railroads are not very far behind. It's just Norfolk Southern drew the bad straw in the bunch. But other railroads you can see are having these catastrophic derailments as well. It's just bad news all around. And FRA, they need to be able to regulate, have favorable regulation for safety instead of this long drawn out process that they do. The FRA should have the power to say, hey, you shouldn't be running trains this long. Let's cut them down to XYZ, 1, 2, 3 amount of length. You shouldn't be able to place this car next to this one because it can create a derailment versus just a, you know, here's our recommendations. Follow those if you like. I don't like that. Is it a good thing? Yes, but we need to be able to take it a step further. There's a regulatory body and they need to regulate. And I think they need a little bit more power, more teeth to do so. But again, we go back to railroad lobbying efforts, PAC funds, and everything else that dampers that drive. And, you know, we can only do so much, but, you know, like you guys have said, the power of the people, we all have a voice. And if we sound off, which all of us need to share this video, the links John and I put on here. The one I posted just kind of gives you a general breakdown of the bill, rail safety bill, and there's text on the bill and a one pager as well. So feel free to share that. My email and phone numbers up in the comments and our state board website. Feel free to check that out. And we also have a call to action page on that website that you can just click. It's free, doesn't cost you anything. You can type in your name and address. That'll pull up every single one of your legislators, and you can just fire off a message to them. So again, thank you for having me on, and I appreciate it.
Greg, if I could just take 1 second, I see your comment there in the chat, and I wanted to give you my 4 points on Cincinnati Southern. Number one, Clyde and I do not have any members that operate over that territory that live in the state of Ohio. So we don't necessarily have an official position. But number two, I don't know that I would trust Norfolk Southern to safely operate over any rail at all in any location. Number three, I feel like the city of Cincinnati could do just as good, if not better, by maintaining the property and renegotiating a better deal. And number four, if I lived in the city of Cincinnati and had the opportunity to vote, I would vote no.
All right, I want to throw one more question in here too. The Railroad Labor Act, for example, has been used to prevent railroad workers from striking and from achieving better working conditions. Should it go?
So here's my response to that, and it's the response that my members hate to hear. The Railroad Labor Act has been cracked open twice since it was written. Both times we had Democratic majorities at the national level by a substantial amount. I mean, not 1 or 2 votes. I mean, they had 65, 75% majorities. And both times the Railway Labor Act got worse for labor. It may not be great, but it's better than what it was before, and it's better than what it could be. And that is a Pandora's box you do not want to crack open with anywhere near what we've got in Washington, D.C. right now. We would end up never being able to strike, like really never being able to strike.
I would agree with what John said, and John and I's previous life, both of us were local chairmen or local union stewards that defended people. And I've defended people that were looking at 15-day suspension because they took their safety glasses off on a sitting still locomotive. There's nothing going to fall in that person's eye. The person's looking at 15 days on the street, no money. So we have rights that our members are entitled to in defense. So that gives us several bites at the apple. So if a member is found guilty, they don't like this guy, he turned in a safety issue. Of course, that's a whistleblower thing as well, but they put him off on the street. Well, we file an appeal. We try to get him back to work. The railroad denies that appeal. Therefore, it goes before an arbitrator. Same thing with monetary amount claims. So if they deny our pay for something they've agreed to, the RLA gives us the right to challenge that on different levels. And I would be afraid those levels would go away if that Pandora's box opened, because John and I both have won favorable hearings that got people back to work, that basically the managers hated these people. They lied on them, fabricated information, and fired them. That's not right. That's the crap that we've dealt with for years. And RLA protects that for us. So that, I mean, that's our saving grace on that. So it just, I was all ready to go for the strike this last time around. I've got my signs.
Everybody was. We were all ready.
I was all ready to go out there with you.
Yep.
Yeah,
It's just such a delicate issue, and unfortunately, I don't think we've got we don't have anywhere near the support in Washington right now to crack that open and come out with any kind of meaningful change, because any change that we would want to make on our end, we'd have to make a concession elsewhere. I mean, that's just how negotiations work. And again, it's not perfect. And I think we could all find flaws there, but the alternative prior to the RLA was, you know, we had 7 people on the crew and 3 of them would come home at the end of the night just because it was such a brutal environment to work under. And, you know, my apologies to the other industries, primarily the airline industry that got rolled in with us. You know, it's not fun, and I don't like it to spread anywhere else that it doesn't need to be. But again, I don't see any good that would come out of it. I really don't. We might win one battle, but we'd lose the war.
But, you know, with the RLA, that was brought on upon us because before our unions merged within themselves to become bigger unions, we were striking, I believe, at the high point almost 300 times a year between all the little unions. And, you know, that put a damper on the economy. Goods, it raised prices on everything. And who's the bad guy? The unions at that point, because we made everybody's stuff go up. I would suggest people look at the Western Pacific strike out west. Western Pacific basically starved out a town that was a unionized town, and the town turned against the union workers because they got starved out. So, I mean, it's just, the strike it's good at proving a point. I get that, but it's bad for everybody involved. And when we strike, it's bad for everybody in the country because everything we touch is affected by that. And I know that's not what people want to hear, but that's the God's honest truth.
Well,
there.
what people want to hear, I think, is that the power be in the hands of the people, and that's where it should be. And that's where, you know, We the People Amendment will get to that. You know, that's why we can't get any traction on legislation that will benefit railroad workers and the communities, putting the people over the profit and all that. But we are over time, and I don't want to keep y'all too late. I know y'all, this is really late for y'all. This is 9:30, right, on the East Coast. Thank you so much for all that you're doing. Keep pushing, keep fighting, keep taking a stand and educating. And my only thing is, if we don't ask for it, if we don't push for it, we're never going to get it. So
That's right.
thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
being here and all the wonderful questions that y'all shared.
Thanks, everybody.
Night.